While we saw before that functions can be a really useful way for repeating some process, if we call the function multiple times, then whatever the body of the function is will get executed multiple different times. You will find that functions have their limitations when it comes to repetition. And one of the other structures that we will use to do repetition, especially when it is larger numbers of times that we want to repeat. For instance, if we wanted to repeat the same process 100 or 1,000 times, we wouldn't want to write our function call 100 times or 1,000 times, so we'll use instead a loop. A loop is a structure that is specifically designed for repeating some body or some process itself lots of different times for a well-defined number of times or a well-defined condition. Today we're going to focus primarily on for loops. They have this particular structure in which we say for some variable in some set or some range. And we'll look at other types of examples for this soon. So whenever I want to do something over and over lots of times, especially if I know how many times or what things will look like when I want to stop, then I can use a loop for that. Here, for instance, this loop is inside of a function, and we can see that just like a function gets its body by doing indentation, the loop gets its body by doing a little more indentation. And so the print statement here is inside of the body of the for loop. Anything that's indented at this level would be counted as a part of the body of the for loop, and it will happen each time the loop runs. So for instance, this one will print the word hello 10 times because this loop will execute 10 times. The range statement there means all of the integers starting at 0 and ending at x minus 1, ending 1 less than what we have. So here, for instance, this range will include 0 through 9. It does not include the 10 that's provided there. But if you count them up, 0 through 9 is 10 numbers. So the confusing part to many programmers is that a 10 is not included in this range, but when I say 10 here, it does mean that that range will have 10 numbers in it, and therefore this loop will execute 10 times. So digging deeper into that statement, for is a keyword that says we're going to be using a for loop. We then define some loop variable. Here our loop variable is called I. Often we use I as a loop variable when we have an integer that we're going to be using as our loop variable. That integer will get values 0 through 9. So the first time that the loop executes, I will be 0. Then we'll print hello, and then it will come back to the top, and I will become 1. And then it will print hello again, and come back to the top, and I will become 2. And so on until I becomes 9, and then it prints the last hello, and the loop finishes. If we include something that's not indented below the loop's body here, then that will only happen after the loop finishes its entire job. So after I has had all of the values 0 through 9, or in other words, after hello has been printed 10 times, then goodbye will be printed 1 time. The loop finished, and so it can step on to the next line. You will remember that I said in the beginning that Python programs tend to execute one line, then the next line, then the next line, and so on. But you can sort of think of loops as being a single line that gets to repeat over and over. Or in other words, this chunk of code gets executed, but that chunk of code specifies that it's going to flip back up to the top once it hits the end of the loop until it runs out of steps to take. Okay, so here's an example that actually uses our I. We could print out I. Our function name is kind of a lie now because it's not 10 hellos, it's going to be 10 numbers. It would print 0 the first time it executes, and then it would flip back up to the top of the for loop. It would change I to be 1, and then it would print 1, and it would go onward and onward up till I gets 9. It prints the 9, and then it has nothing left in its range, so it finishes the for loop, and it would execute any code that comes after the for loop, which there isn't any in this example. So this for loop has 2 lines of code inside of its body. What it's going to be doing is x starts at 1 before the for loop even begins, and since this for loop is inside of the same function as that x, it's allowed to use that x, and it's even allowed to change that x, and that's what it's going to do. It's going to print 1 the first time the loop executes, and then it will set x to be 1 times 2, in other words 2, and it will flip back up to the start of the for loop. Since there are more numbers in the range, since there are more steps to do, it will come back down, it will print out the 2 that x currently stores, and then it will set x to be 2 times 2, in other words 4, and it will flip back up to the start of the for loop. And so long as there are still steps in that range to do, as long as there are still numbers in that range that we can assign to I, then it's going to keep using this here. So the for loop in some cases in Python will be a little extraneous because we have this I variable sometimes that we're just not using. Here we didn't use the I. Often you will want that I number, and so it's provided for you there sort of in the default structure of the for loop. And then similar to our previous example, once the powers of 2 that we're generating here have been printed out, the first 10 of them, then the for loop will finish and it will say for loop is done. 1 time, because this is not inside of a loop, and so it won't get repeated over and over. Only the indented stuff that's inside the loop will get repeated. So one way to think of this is each time the loop runs, that these 2 things will happen. X will get printed, and then X will be given a new value equal to twice its current value. There's sort of 3 things happening in that when we flip back up to the top, I gets a new value, but that's kind of irrelevant here because we're not using the I. In other programming languages, you'll see other structures that allow you to skip the I variable, or you will be able to define these a little more broadly. But in Python, the typical structure is this for loop. There are other types of loops in Python that we may see at later points, but the for loop is pretty versatile and pretty useful. So here is a function that will allow us to print some phrase lots of times. The user will define n, the number of times that we would like our phrase to be printed, and they will define what the phrase is. And then we say for I in range n, meaning that we're going to repeat our for loop n times, giving the values 0 through n minus 1, because remember that range n goes from 0 but not quite up to n, which is n many numbers. If they give us 10, we'll loop 10 times. If they give us 100, we'll loop 100 times. So the thing fed to the range can be a variable that has some numerical value and will then loop that many times. And otherwise, as I say, I is a variable that takes on a new value each time the loop gets run. Here it's getting numerical values within that range. Range actually has a broader set of ways that it can be used. The most common will be to say range and then where that range should stop, or in other words, one number larger than the highest number you're going to get from that range. So if I say range 10, again, I'll get the numbers 0 through 9. If I say range 100, I'll get the numbers 0 through 99, and so on. But I can define a start and a stop to it to say I would like the numbers 1 through 10, which would actually give me 1 through 9, because remember, the 10 is not included. So it still follows the same rule for that stop part every time, but it will include whatever you define as the start. So you can sort of think of range 10 as being range 0, 10, and that would be the numbers 0 through 9. This here is the numbers 1 through 9. Range 110 is the numbers 1 through 9. You also can define the amount you would like it to step by each time. For instance, I can say range 1 to 10, stepping by 2. This would give me 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. So it increments by 2 every time. I could even count down, and I could count down by -3, for instance, so that I would have 10, 7, and so on through this range, stopping before 1. So the stop is still excluded. It is always the second number if we're providing more than one number. If there's only the single number, then that will just be the stop. I could have written this as -1, and then it would give me the numbers 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, etc. as well. So you can get a little broader range of things from the range function if you specify more than just where to stop. You can specify where to start, and you can specify how it steps from one number to another, or how much it steps from one number to another. One thing we often want to do with loops is to keep track of something throughout the loop, and especially to accumulate information or to build a result. Examples of this might include adding characters onto a string so that you get a longer and longer string each time, adding things into a list, adding numbers as we see here. So this is a multiply function that takes x and y and will multiply them, and it does that simply by adding over and over. Since multiplication is repeated addition, then we can do that. We can write a for loop that adds our number y over and over as long as it does it x many times. So if you gave me 5 and 11, this will take 11 and add it to itself 5 times so that you get the result of 55. And this kind of structure of accumulating some result is a pretty common one to do with for loops, whether that's by adding, whether it's by comparing and getting the maximum of a set of things. Lots of possibilities. Here, we're adding and adding and adding to get our final result. We also can loop over sets of things. And you will find that this is actually really broad, possibly broader than you thought it might be reasonable to do. But one of the simpler examples of this is that we can loop over all of the items in a list. In Python, we use square brackets, and then we use commas to separate items to make up a list. So everything contained within the square brackets is the list. How do I know which things are individual items? Well, they are separated by commas. So this list contains the numbers 1, 3, 10, and 8. And my for loop is saying for each item in that list, 1, 3, 10, and 8, in that order, I want to print them. I could do lots of different things with them potentially. Another thing to note here is that I've shown that the loop variable does not just have to be named I. I is a pretty common name for a loop variable, especially when the variable that you're getting is an integer, like when we were doing our ranges. But it could be any sort of different thing. So I mentioned that this kind of loop can be used over lots of different stuff. You can use this kind of loop when we get to reading in files to read each line from the file. And so I could name my variable there line if I wanted to. I've named it X in this case because I'm grabbing some unknown thing from this list over here. And lists can contain any kind of data. They could contain numbers, they could contain strings, lots of different types of data that you can contain inside of lists. You can even make lists of lists, as we'll see probably at later points down the line. But here we have a pretty straightforward example where we're just saying, okay, what values is X going to get? Well, it's going to get 1 first, and we'll print 1. All right, now when we flip back up to the top, we know that we already handled 1, so X is going to get 3 now, and we'll print 3. And then we'll flip back up to the top of the for loop. X will get 10, and we'll print it. Flip back, X will get 8, and we'll print it. And now, just like when we ran out of numbers in our range, here we have run out of items in our list, and so the for loop will exit, and any code that came after the for loop, or in other words, was not indented down here, would get executed at that point in time. Here's another, a little more complex use of looping with a list. So we've defined my list as a variable, and it is the numbers 18, 312, 55, and 9. I start out some total, so I'm doing that accumulating thing again, and I'm adding them all up. So here I've reverted back to using I. These are numbers. It seems reasonable to call them I. They're integers even. So I say for each I in my list, then the total equals the total plus that I, that number. So total starts as 0, and then I hit my loop. I gets 18, and so total equals 0 plus 18, and it becomes 18 there. And then I gets 312, and total is going to get 312 added to it. And then we flip back up, I gets 55, and so total will get 55 added to it. And so by the end of this, we will have the total, the sum of all of the items from this list here. So we can do a wide range of things with this. If we've got some grouping of data, whether that's a range of numbers using the range function, or whether that's a list like these ones here. So the for loop allows us to repeat the body of the code that lives indented inside of that for loop statement. It gives us some loop variable, like I or X in the examples that we've seen here. That variable gets new values from some range, from some list, from some grouping or pattern each time the loop flips back around. And each time the loop runs, everything inside of the loop's body will get executed. And that things that follow the loop are not indented and are not a part of the loop's body will only get executed after the loop finishes its entire job of repeating over and over however many times it's specified to execute.